Good morning, everyone. Oh, you can hear me. Hi, everyone. We are going to get started. We have a lot of announcements today before the presentation, so we'll dive right in. First of all, thank you so much to our sponsor. That got loud. Thank you so much to our sponsor, Woodworks, for sponsoring this meeting. Erin is going to give a few words on Woodworks.
All right. Hey, everybody. Thanks so much for having Woodworks here today. My name is Erin, and I have just a couple quick things to share about Woodworks. So first, most importantly, if you don't know, we provide free assistance on commercial and multifamily wood projects throughout the U.S. If you have any questions, take a look at our website, woodworks.org. There's a huge library of resources there, including sustainability, carbon, and LCA topics. It's also kind of fun to check out the Woodworks Innovation Network, which showcases completed and in construction wood projects throughout the country. I'll be at the back of the room if you have any questions or if there's anything I can help you with afterwards. And again, thanks so much for having us here today.
Thank you, Erin. All right, so we're going to start something new at our breakfast meetings, where each breakfast meeting will present a little bit more background on different SEAC committees so that everyone is aware of what's happening in the committees, and then if they have interest in joining them as well. Sorry, that was I was too quick, apparently. So today we're going to, Mackenzie's going to give a little bit of insight into the SEAC Sustainable Design Committee. Oh, I'll take the blame.
Hi, I'm Mackenzie Glass. I'm the chair of the SEAC Sustainable Design Committee. And we just wanted to take a minute today to let you all know a little bit about who we are and what we're doing. So Michael Lyons is the co-chair of the committee. And we started the committee a little bit under a year ago. And it kind of started with a few of us structural engineers in the state of Colorado just talking about how it would be really nice to have some resources that we can talk about related to sustainability within our state with all of the upcoming changes. And so that resulted in us joining the NCSEA Sustainable Design Committee. So that Sustainable Design Committee at the national level started about a year and a half ago. And the idea behind that committee is that they wanted each SEA member organization to have their own sustainable design committee and to have at least one person to join the national committee. The idea being that we can share information on a national level and then bring that information to both the sustainable design committees at the state level and then also to our member organizations. So we've been participating in those national committee meetings, and you can see the mission and the objectives for both are very similar. So mission to be promote sustainable design practices within the profession of structural engineering through leadership, advocacy, outreach, and education. And what that means for us objectively is that we're really trying to promote education. So education within our committee itself to make sure we're all kind of have the same basic understanding, but then when it comes to new policies, new methodologies, new practices, where we can really help each other out. Another big portion of this is advocacy. So we want to be there to help advocate for us as structural engineers within the practice of sustainable design. And then we would also like to have, help with advocating for us as a SEAC and the Sustainable Design Committee itself. So if you guys are interested in joining, we meet about every 6 weeks. Typically we meet virtually, but we're meeting after the meeting today. So if you'd like to join today, you're welcome to stop by. And I would say the last point is just if your company has any interest in the SE 2050 commitment program, for those of you that don't know, this is the SE 2050 commitment program goal is to reduce and ultimately eliminate embodied carbon in our projects by 2050. And so for those of you that are interested in your firm joining this program, our committee is here to serve as another resource to help get that going and help each other through the process. So we'd love to have you join if you're interested. Thank you.
All right, just a few other announcements. SEAC Education Committee through the Zimcor Hands-On Welding event. It was well attended. There was 34 people that attended. And so visit the SEAC website to keep up to date with other events offered by the SEAC Education Committee. Like this one, the Education Committee and the Sustainable Design Committee invite you to the CSU Spur Education Center project presentation and tour. This is Tuesday, June 27th, and you will be able to register on the website. So keep an eye out for that and any emails for when that registration opens. Fall seminar, save the date. It is going to be October 12th, typical time from 7 a.m. to 12:30. And typical location, at least for the past few years, the Doubletree Hilton Hotel in Westminster. And the topics will be announced at a later date, but save the date for October 12th. And the SEAC Education Committee is looking for new members. So I stress this every meeting, but they do a lot of great work for our organization, have a lot of great events, including that fall seminar. So if you're interested, Mayor, if you want to raise your hand, please reach out to Mayor if you're interested in joining in any capacity. We appreciate it. Golf tournament is August 24th, and this is a golf tournament that we've always been involved with over the years, and it's a function that's put on by 4 different organizations. If you're interested in joining or participating, please reach out to Dawn in the back. And then also the SEAC 2023 surveys. So everyone should have received an email on the individual compensation survey. And then also there's the business practice survey. Business practice survey by businesses is due by the end of this month. Individual compensation survey is due by June 15th. I definitely recommend everyone to participate. This is a huge perk for your SEAC membership. And with the individual compensation survey, if you participate, then you get the results as well. So definitely recommend everyone to participate in that. Committee meetings, these are all now announced on the website. So feel free to go to the website to see the committee meeting dates. And also, please follow SEAC on social media. We have an Instagram live, but where there's a lot of great content on the social media. And finally, I would like to introduce Ben Nelson, who's going to share the recipients of the SEAC scholarship for this year.
Thank you, Holly. I'm here to represent the SEAC Scholarship Foundation. It is a 501c3 nonprofit organization that was created in 2007. The foundation was created to fund and administer academic scholarships to worthy Colorado students within the state in the structural engineering field. The foundation's assets were initially established from 11 founding donors and 2 individuals. We also accept annual donations from individuals and firms as well to help fund our efforts. The foundation consists of Jeanette Torrance, who is not able to join us today as chair, Evan Hamill, who is our treasurer. I think Evan is here. I thought Evan was here. Jordan Jarrett, who is our secretary, Marianne Davis, Paul Haas, and myself are board members. I'm pleased to report this year that we had 16 scholarship applicants, 12 of which completed the application process, and the board selected 6 finalists for in-person interviews, which were conducted. All 6 finalists were awarded complimentary student membership within SEAC here, so hopefully we'll see more of them over the course of this coming year. The 6 finalists were interviewed, and we selected 2 winners this year. Ian Gorner, why don't you come on up, Ian? And Joseph Verkler, both are graduating students from the Colorado School of Mines. Joseph is not here today, but Ian is. And so Ian, although they both get awarded a $3,000 scholarship, Ian also benefits by the bacon that we received today as well. So I'd like to congratulate Ian. He's a graduating senior with the School of Mines. Joseph is a graduating, will be a graduate student in December. More information regarding these winners will be in the next SEAC newsletter. And if you're interested, this is my shameless plug. If you're interested in contributing to the foundation by making a tax-deductible donation, please contact any of our board members. Thank you so much. Congratulations to Ian, and I'll give him the mic. He's only going to talk for, I told him to limit it to 30 minutes. To discuss, tell us a little bit about what he's going to do for the summer and a little bit about himself.
Thank you. Yeah, like you said, I finished my senior year at School of Mines this past semester, and I'll be doing my graduate degree in structural engineering in the fall. This summer, I'm doing an internship with Bar Engineering, and I'm going to be out in Michigan for that. And they do a lot of power and mining stuff, so I'm not exactly sure what I'm doing. I leave tomorrow. I'll show up the first day, and they'll tell me what I'm doing then. So thank you for the scholarship.
Yeah. Congrats, Ian. All right, so now we're going to get going with our presentation. Today, we're going to have a presentation by our very own SEAC members, are also members of this SEAC Sustainable Design Committee and on the SEAC Board of Directors. And the presentation is going to be on the Buy Clean Colorado Act and the Denver Green Code. Our presenters for today, Mackenzie Glass. She serves as Martin Sustainability Manager and is a structural project engineer on the investigative team. She has 7 years of experience, specializes in innovative, sustainable materials, methodologies, operations, and design. She's also involved with many professional organizations. In addition to SEAC, she's on the NCSCA Sustainable Design Committee and American Council of Engineering, Colorado. Our second presenter for today, Kim Olson. She's a licensed structural engineer. She is currently a manager in Nucor's Construction Solutions Group, where she leads their national accounts and technical strategies. And prior to Nucor, she was the HSS consulting engineer for the Steel Tube Institute. She's also a member, in addition to SEAC, also a member of several AISC, AWS, and ASTM technical committees. So warm welcome to Mackenzie and I'll take the blame for that one too.
Testing. Okay. Keep going. Okay. Sorry all for the scares here. I will try to stand a step away from that speaker and see if that helps. Okay. All right. Good morning, everyone. Thank you for joining the presentation today on the Buy Clean Colorado Act and the Denver Green Code. Today we have a few different objectives. The first of which is getting the clicker to work. Okay, we're up and running. All right, so the objectives for today's presentation is first for all of us to recognize some basic sustainable design terminology to get us all on the same page. Next, Kim will be reviewing the federal legislation of what's happening kind of big picture in the United States. Then we're going to focus on a little bit more at the state level, Buy Clean Colorado, and then focus in a little bit more on what's happening at the local level. So in Colorado, specifically the Denver Green Code. We want to understand how these policies really affect us as structural engineers within our designs and our construction documents. And then really understand how we can help as a design team to be proactive team members so that we're really pushing forward everything that we can do from the engineering side of things. Last, we want to understand the structural material procurement. So first, to start off, we are going to review some basic terminology. We'll start with the term embodied carbon, and you'll hear today a lot about embodied carbon. Traditionally, we've seen a lot of talk around operational carbon, right? And now the industry, specifically the structural industry, is really being pushed to focus on embodied carbon. So what is this? Well, the embodied carbon is the greenhouse gas emissions, and it's really associated from all the way from the very beginning where we're extracting the materials, you can see in the chart here on the left, all the way to the end of life. And you can see the blue represents the building operations, and that is excluded from the embodied carbon that we're talking about. Next is an environmental product declaration. By a show of hands, who knows what an environmental product declaration is? Okay, so we're doing pretty good. We've got about 50% or so. And so the environmental product declaration, or an EPD, is essentially a nutrition label for our structural materials that are going into our buildings. And what we're looking for here when we're looking at an environmental product declaration is the global warming potential, or your GWP value. And that global warming potential is in kilograms of carbon dioxide equivalent units. And you'll see that that's what means equivalent. That's essentially taking your carbon dioxide, and they're looking at the global warming causes from carbon dioxide, and they're taking the other greenhouse gases and trying to create that to an equivalent carbon dioxide in terms of global warming, so that we're able to compare apples to apples in terms of the different greenhouse gases and how we're measuring its impact on the global warming. For the environmental product declarations, there's a few different main types that you'll hear. You'll hear about the industry average EPDs, and these EPDs cover multiple products over multiple manufacturers in multiple locations, and then those manufacturers are able to use those environmental product declarations. There's a product-specific EPD, which is one product from one manufacturer, but from multiple locations, potentially. And then there's a facility-specific EPD. So that is environmental product declaration that represents one product from one manufacturer at a single manufacturer's location. So when we're looking at the term embodied carbon, and as structural engineers, we're just kind of used to the traditional materials and ways of our practice. So one of the new easy equations that we can look at is how you calculate embodied carbon. So you're simply taking your material quantity or your volumes. You can get that quick hand calc, your spreadsheets, or from a Revit model, for example. You multiply it by that global warming potential number that you just saw from the environmental product declaration. And from that, you can get your estimated embodied carbon. Now, those environmental product declarations, one place that they can be found that is the most common is in EC3. So EC3 stands for the Embodied Carbon in Construction Calculator. So this is an online database where you can go and find EPDs from all around the country, and you can filter that based on your specific interests in terms of concrete strength or fly ash percentages, different things like that. So EC3 is often used in combination with your life cycle assessments. Don't worry, we're almost done with the terminology part here. So LCA is looking at the environmental impact of your building from the start to the end of life, and even as far as recycling the materials at the end. So there are a few different LCA softwares out there that are approved within our industry. Athena and Tally both it's used in combination with that EC3 database that hosts the EPDs. And then the other one is one-click LCA that consultants are often using. And that specific software has its own internal EPD database. So when you're looking at these life cycle assessments, there are different stages that you can take into account. Oftentimes, from the structural engineering side of things, we'll look at the A1 to A3 stage, which is the extraction of your material, the transportation of that material from the site to the manufacturing facility, and then the manufacturing of that material itself. And the reason why we're looking at that stage early on is just because it has the largest impact from an embodied carbon standpoint in terms of that material production. So why do we care about embodied carbon? And you know, from a global perspective, our building and construction industry is responsible for almost 40% of global carbon emissions, which is a huge number. So, you know, unless we do something as an industry, we can't help in terms of the global goals of the 1.5 to 2 degrees Celsius maximum temperature increase that we've been given. And so if you look at the pie chart on the right, you can see that the building operations accounts for about 28% of that, but then the building materials and construction is 11% of that, which is about half of the transportation industry. So you can look at it a couple ways of, well, this is just a big effort and I don't know how we can make that big of a difference. Or you can look at it as, hey, this is a great opportunity for us as an industry because it accounts for a large portion of global warming, and any change that we can make can help to drive that in the right direction and in a positive way. So it's also important to point out that whatever political beliefs that you have, as an industry, we're here to serve our clients and our clients' needs. And so more than ever, we're having the request of helping to understand how to measure the environmental impacts of our buildings and getting these requests from our clients and making sure that we can help them understand what they can do. So from a consultant standpoint, it's really important for us to at least be able to have a basic understanding of how we can help our clients to make these changes. Industry, you said? That's essentially just accounting for everything else in the carbon emissions that's not stated. Like it's everything else in the carbon that contributes to carbon emissions. Yeah. Okay, and with that, I'm going to pass it on to Kim, and we will hope for the best with our mics.
Morning. Does it work? Okay. Morning. Let's try that again. Good morning. Hi. How's everybody? Barely awake. All right. Okay. So this morning I'm going to talk a little bit about the Buy Clean legislation. Has anybody even heard Buy Clean? That term? A little bit. Yeah. Okay, good. So we're going to talk about it in generalities, and then we'll dive deep into the federal and specifically what's happening here in Colorado, because we're fortunate in that we're on the forefront of this to see this enacted in our state. So the definition of a Buy Clean policy is basically that it's a procurement policy. So we're trying to address embodied carbon. It's achieved by basically shifting the focus of the purchasing practices of people that are buying materials for our building construction. So it's really leveraging that purchasing power of the public agencies. So about 32% of the carbon emissions average is attributed in that building sector is attributed to public buildings and publicly funded projects, which would also include transportation. And so that's why there's the focus here. So that's kind of the general acknowledgement or general definition of Buy Clean. For us as engineers, what it really tells us is that these policies are going to limit the amount of global warming potential our materials can have in the materials that we're putting inside of our buildings. So the why, I mentioned that 32% of carbon emissions in the building structure are attributed to public projects. So that's really where the focus is being being placed. I think we've all heard when it comes to carbon and sustainability, we're more familiar with it on an operational carbon basis. So we're talking about, efficient lighting and efficient mechanical systems and things like that. We're all very used to that, and we've seen that for a number of years. Now we're not abandoning that effort, but we're really shifting the focus more towards embodied carbon, this other portion of the pie that Mackenzie showed that focuses on just our materials. And you can see that our materials do affect them greatly, both from steel and cement. And so you'll see that a lot of the focus is on those two materials in particular. No, I knew that was going to happen. It's time with the clicker, bear with me. Okay, so when we're talking about buy clean policies in general, regardless of whether it's federal or state level, regardless of which state we're talking about, they're going to have these components there. So the first we're going to look at is the scope. So what materials are included in the policy? It's not a one size fits all, as you'll see on the next chart. They're kind of a mix and match. So it's not like if you learn about buy clean from a perspective in California, that you know exactly what's happening in Colorado or on the federal level. They are all very different. And in that scope, that's really where that's defined. So which materials are impacted and which projects have to abide by these policies. Also, the governing agency is defined. So is it the state architect? Is it in California, the Department of General Services? It's, who is it that is in charge of actually enforcing this policy? The data, a lot of what you'll see in sustainability and the really big focus right now is data. So we know that we have a problem with embodied carbon in our materials. We know we need to get better, but how do we measure that? How do we define what that level is that we need to be under when we're putting these materials into our structures? So there's a lot of data behind all of this, and some of that's been a little bit hard to come by, but it's getting up to speed, and the federal government is helping in that regard as well. There may be some standards, so the Buy Clean policy may just say that you need to provide an EPD, or it may say that your materials have to be below a certain level and you have to provide an EPD to prove that. There may also be incentives. So I like to think about this as the purchasing power of the government. So the government is really kind of forcing the hand of the free market. So rather than waiting for the free market to decide that sustainability is something that we really need to pay attention to, the government is kind of forcing our hand in that. And doing so, they may be providing incentives to help get us all on board, depending on the different policies. And then compliance. Obviously, these aren't just rules that are out there floating around and we can choose to abide by them or not, but there's a compliance component to it. So what are we as engineers going to have to supply? Is it just something in our specs? Are we going to have to review EPDs? Are we going to have to provide EPDs? Those are all things that are included in each one of the policies as well. So this map shows where we're at today. So sustainability is a rapidly changing topic. From a federal level, both the United States and Canada both have Buy Clean policies enacted. From a state level, you can see that there are a number of states. So the dark green are the ones that have actually passed something into law. So as far as California and Colorado, we are more of a traditional Buy Clean where it covers several materials and we need to be below a GWP level. Right now, Oregon and New York are at a level where they're just focusing on concrete and it's not for all projects. So they're more of in a Buy Clean light stage at this point. The ones highlighted in a lighter green are the ones that have introduced it into their legislature, but maybe hasn't passed officially yet. And then the states that you see with asterisks next to them, they have somewhere in the state there, they've enacted a local law. So this runs the gamut from federal all the way down to local. So there may be a specific municipality in Texas, I believe it's in Austin, that does have some Buy Clean policies in effect. This map, just so you guys know, for those of you that are doing design outside of Colorado, is on the CLF website. And it's a great resource to check to see if you're doing work outside of Colorado where you're not sure if there's any of this Buy Clean legislation. It's a great resource to go to, kind of check it out and see what might be there. So as far as the trends are concerned, this chart I know may be a little bit hard to read, but it kind of gives you a flavor for the discrepancies across the different buy clean policies. They're all very different. We won't dive deep into this, but you can see just from the top, there are different materials that are being impacted for each one of them. Things like EPD reporting, for example, in California, you have to have a facility-specific EPD. In Colorado, you can use a product-specific EPD, and Mackenzie talked about the differences between those two. And then how they set their standards. Are we just trying to provide EPDs? Are we providing material that meets industry averages? Are we providing material that is below that, like maybe in the bottom 20% as far as the impact is concerned? So they're all very different. And like I said, all of these variables are changing rapidly. California is pretty much set in place. That's enacted and it's active. Colorado, we'll talk about the specifics of that. And I mean, even just, I think it was Tuesday night, the GSA came out with what they're going to provide as far as infrastructure funding is concerned. There is a buy clean attached to that as well. And they're just now rolling out some of that for some of their pilot projects. So speaking of the federal legislation, Biden announced an executive order which launched the Buy Clean Task Force. So it had been done in California, and he brought it to a federal level. What it does is, in general, it prioritizes the use of low carbon, made in America construction materials for federally funded projects. So again, remembering that this is tax dollar funded projects is what this is tied to. It's the single largest amount of money that's ever been dedicated to climate change by the United States. And it includes many different levels here. The ones of note are the EPA was given about $250 million for EPD assistance. So as I mentioned, the data for all of these products in construction didn't exist 10 years ago. So we've got a lot of work to do to collect the data and to get it third-party verified and to be able to compare apples to apples across our different building materials. So the EPA is providing assistance to help some manufacturers generate EPDs and get them kind of going with that process. Also, you'll notice that the GSA is given over $2 billion to source low carbon materials for their projects. So that's what I was mentioning. They've just set out some limits. Just this week, they're working on that for 11 pilot projects, and then we will see it rolled out in a greater scale to all of the infrastructure funding that we've seen released from the government recently. Buy Clean California, you may or may not do work in California, but it's important to talk about it because it was really the first place that we saw something like this, a policy like this. It is active right now. So if you're doing work in California, if you're doing it with Caltrans, you're doing it for any publicly funded project in California, you have to abide by Buy Clean California Act. The limits were published in 2022. They set GWP limits based on industry averages. So that's kind of the line that you have to hit. We're being expected to provide that information in our specifications to notify the contractor and everybody involved in the procurement that is something that they have to provide. And California is unique in that you're required to provide a facility-specific EPD. And that's a whole nother level of EPDs that not every manufacturer is going to have right now. A lot of them have gone down the path of product-specific. And so facility-specific really dives into that a little bit deeper. If they have 5 facilities that are making a certain product, now they have to divide that up and actually show what the impact for each facility is. And it has to match the documentation that says where that material came from for that specific project. We also look towards California because they were on the forefront of this Buy Clean legislation to think about what might be coming down the pipe because they've been at it for a few years. They've had some lessons learned. They kind of have the experience of what's working and what's not. And so we kind of look to California to see what they're working on next. And these two things are not official. They haven't been enacted, but we see them in their state legislature already. The first one is AB 2446. So Basically, what this does is it applies to most non-residential buildings and then residential projects with 5 or more units included in them. So a big bulk. Notice that this is not tied necessarily to tax funding. This is all projects. But what's really stark and got my attention is the goal for this bill. Granted, it hasn't been enacted, but the goal is to reduce the intensity of carbon in new construction by 80% by 2045, in 20 years. That's significant. That's a big, big number. And they've also set themselves some goals along the way of reduction. So again, this hasn't been passed, but this kind of gives you an idea for where we're going in the future. Additionally, they're talking about implementing a building code called the California Green Building Standards Code, CalGreen for short, which would be the first green building code in the United States, the first one that's state mandated anyway. And it has a different proposal that's pretty interesting that gives you kind of 3 paths. So far we've talked about you just have to provide materials that have a global warming potential that's less than a certain value. What the Green Building Code or CalGreen does is it gives you 3 options. So you can do a whole building life cycle analysis. You can investigate building preservation, so kind of reuse and resilience of our buildings. Or they can set a target where this is your embodied carbon per square foot allowance. And you as a design team, choose how you're going to go about satisfying that. So it gives you a little bit more opportunity and leeway into how you want to actually meet these provisions. So again, just something that may be coming our way. All right, so what's happening here in Colorado? Super important to know. This was signed into law in July of 2021 by Governor Polis. The state has a goal to reduce its embodied carbon emissions by 50% by 2030 and 90% by 2050. So that's not just attributed just to the building sector, that's the overall state. I'm sure you've seen some of the headlines that are going on with our Excel and power plants and things like that in the state. So that's rolled into those figures. So this policy includes statutes for the Office of the State Architect as well as CDOT. So it applies to both types of projects. CDOT is about a year behind the state architect in that they took a year to collect EPDs to figure out what their carbon intensities were for the materials that they were actually being used in their projects before they assign limits and things and restrictions on where we need to play for that. Again, this is going to apply to publicly funded projects in the state of Colorado. So any tax dollars that are associated with a project that you're working on will fall underneath this Buy Clean Colorado Act, as long as the cost exceeds $500,000, and that includes design and construction. And it's for any project that a solicitation is granted after January 1st of next year. So that's basically when an RFP is issued, if it's issued on January 1st or after January 1st of next year, it will have to abide by Buy Clean Colorado. Anything you're working on right now is safe. So the Office of the State Architect is going to provide a maximum acceptable GWP limit. So they're going to set limits. They've put draft limits out so far, so we have an idea of where we need to hit. But those final limits are going to be given at the end of June, so pretty soon. A product-specific EPD is what's required to prove that your material meets that. And then new values are going to continue to be released. So they're going to release new values in February of 2024. We think it's because some of the materials that are included in Buy Clean Colorado don't have the data yet, and so they need to wait and release some additional values in February. But I think for this room, all of the materials that we're typically using, we already have values. We know where we need to hit. And then much like California is the same way, but Colorado is also going to continue to reduce these limits. So they've set a time period in Colorado, it's every 4 years. The Office of the State Architect and CDOT as well are going to revisit these lines that they've drawn, these limits that they've given us, and they will continue to push them down. As far as responsibilities, so the state agency and the institutions of the higher education are responsible for these items for meeting these buy clean requirements. So they have to build into the budget that the materials that they're going to use are going to meet these requirements. So if it might cost a little bit more to get a greener concrete mix or less carbon intensive steel, then they need to build that into the budgets. They need to ask their consultants, that would be us, to specify EPD requirements for the eligible materials. So in our specifications, we need to include that the steel and the concrete and the wood need to abide by these limits. They're going to require the contractors to submit all these EPDs proving that they're meeting those limits. And they have to submit them as part of a code compliance documentation at the end of the project. There's also an ability to apply for a waiver, and I'll talk about that in a second. For those of you that are doing projects on like CU's campus or CSU, some of those public institutions that they may already have some of these things in their specifications. So it's just worth double checking to make sure that they've got it. But some of these institutions and these organizations have already been implementing this practice before the policy has gone into effect. As far as consultants, what do we need to do? So we need to be aware of it. Obviously, we need to prioritize products, try and shift our focus towards products that are going to meet these limits. We need to specify what we need in our specifications. So it's pertinent for us, even though, you know, contractors and everyone should understand that this is under buy clean. It's worth the effort to go ahead and put it in your specifications to make sure that the people actually procuring the materials know about that. Because as you know, there can sometimes be a disconnect there. And then we will be required to verify that the GWP for the materials that the contractor is planning to use for the project, that they do meet the GWP requirements of the policy. So we think that it's going to look something like a shop drawing type submittal where let's say the steel fabricator is going to have to submit to me who they're getting their steel from and their EPD so that I can verify that it meets the GWP limit. Correct, yeah. Like a mixed design would come with an EPD and we verify that it's below the GWP limit, yeah. Yeah, it may or may not need to be stamped. So I should have prefaced all of this talk with, this is all very new, and the state of what we've found is that the state is really just trying to figure it out as we go, right? And I experienced it firsthand when I was dealing with California as well, is that it's a learning process, and they have to get their processes in place in order to do the verification and to ensure that this policy is being abided by. So some of these things are the best information that we have right now, and we will continue. Sustainability committee will continue to get you guys information as it rolls out when we have a better idea. And if you've gone through this process, we would love to hear your feedback as you start digging into it. If it's something different than this presentation, or you have feedback on you experienced with the state and going through this, or the office of the state architect, that'd be super helpful too, so we can get that information out to everybody so they have a better idea as this evolves. Okay, contractors. So they're obviously at the forefront of this, since they're the ones typically that are controlling most of the actual procurement of the materials. So they're going to be required to obtain EPDs for all of the materials on their project that are controlled by this policy. And then they have to submit compliant EPDs. And they have to let us know if a waiver is needed. We'll talk about waivers. So there may be situations where a particular project can't get a material that meets the policy. And in that case, if we know that in a design phase that we're going to want to use something that has a carbon intensity above the limit, we can go ahead and apply for that during design to the OSA. Contractors can do the same thing. If they find out during bidding that the material's not available anymore because maybe the supply chain changed or that there's no options out there, they can also apply for a waiver. What that whole waiver process looks like, how hard it is to obtain, all of those things are TBD. But you should know that there is the opportunity, and they have written that there, that you can get a waiver. There's an opportunity for that. You guys will see these in the slides, so don't worry about the numbers. Just to put these up here so you guys have an idea of what the limits are. So first thing to remember is that these are draft. So they haven't released the final limits. So this is what we've seen in draft form from OSA, but you never know till it's written, right? So for steel, the limit is the industry-wide EPD. So anything below industry average would be acceptable. For concrete, it's a little bit more regional. So they've taken data from EC3 and done an analysis of the EPDs that are for the Rocky Mountain region, and then taken an average of that. So it's less, it's more specific to our area, to the state of Colorado, where they've found that average. And then lastly, wood is the values that the limits that's being set there are the industry-wide EPDs for wood as well. As far as materials are concerned, what is written into the policy, Colorado is in the forefront of this because we're very broad in our definition of the policy. California is very focused on steel, reinforcing, flat glass, and mineral wool insulation. So just those 4 materials are included in Buy Clean California. So Colorado has really done what we perceive as the better thing and included all of the building materials in it. So steel, concrete, wood, asphalt, glass, PT, and reinforcing are all included in Buy Clean Colorado. So all of those materials will have DWP limits set for them. We don't have the draft values for these other materials that are listed here, and so TBD, those will come out at the end of June. And then lastly, compliance. So what happens, how are they ensuring that we're abiding by this policy? There's a closeout form that is going to be needed to be submitted by the contractor in order for them to get their CO. And that's what they're going to have to provide all of their EPDs for these materials. So if they don't provide the EPDs, then they don't get their certificate of occupancy. Yeah. Lacey just said, wow, it's a big deal. So, okay, I'm going to pass it to Mackenzie to talk on a local level.
Okay, so now we talked a little bit about what happens at the state level. So moving forward, where are we at from the local level and the Denver Green Code? So the Denver Green Code was initially based on the International Green Construction Code, and that was the original format of the Denver Green Code. However, it's important to note that moving forward, they're not trying to stick to following the format of that code. And the reason being is that, like Kim mentioned, Colorado, the Denver community, we have our own needs and requests for different sustainable demands within our industry. And so really the Denver Green Code it already has started to evolve away from that the International Green Construction Code. There are about 4 different areas that the Denver Green Code is focused on. Those 4 areas are the carbon impact or the climate change mitigation. The second one is the balanced use of resources. Third is the community resilience, and fourth is ecosystem health. So the Denver Green Code right now is more focused on that first climate mitigation item. And then moving forward, they're hoping to incorporate more and more of those other items that you see on that list. But right now, that's really where the focus is headed. So the first edition of the Denver Green Code was introduced in 2019. This was a 100% voluntary code. And it's important to note that really these local policies, especially when they start off as optional policies, that's kind of the first step to the legislation. So there may be 100% optional now, but then in a few years, they'll start to have a few more requirements, and then a few more years might be a few more requirements, and then legislation. So that's oftentimes how you'll see these policies progress. We'll wait for it. There we go. Okay, so the Denver Green Code now, the 2022 Denver Green Code has gone into effect as of May 1st. So we're a couple weeks into this now, which is why we wanted to get this out in front of you guys before too much time passed. So now there is a limited mandatory use. This means that for all new construction and all major commercial renovations, it is mandatory that you follow the 2022 Denver Green Code. There are some exceptions, some of that being residential construction following the IRC. So, single family, 1 to 2 family homes do not have to comply with the Denver Green Code. That they can obviously choose the optional route and go ahead and participate if they choose to do so. Like I said, the code is already into effect. It's currently updated every 3 years, so it trails the IBC updates by about 1 year. This timeline may or may not change moving forward, just depending on the needs of the Colorado community. And then the code does not apply to, again, manufactured homes or any homes that don't use electricity, lighting, water, that kind of a thing. And so when we're looking at definitions, the controlling agency here is the Building, Permitting, and Inspection Services of the City and County of Denver. When we're talking about major commercial renovations, what does that mean? Well, it's a building project that contains the lesser floor area of the following, either 100,000 square feet or the gross floor area greater than 50% of your existing building that you're adding on to. So that's what qualifies you to, if you fall into one of those categories, then you have to comply with this 2022 Denver Green Code. So like I mentioned, we are a couple weeks into this code already. There are transition rules that do apply. And it would apply to a small percentage of buildings here. But if your project happens to fall under a major project, which is defined as a project that is valued at $10 million or more, and you can have your foundation package permitted by July 1st, then you have the option to petition the building official to follow the 2019 optional Denver Green Code. That would also require you to have all remaining phases in by September 1st of this year. However, if you don't fall into that category, you are required to comply with these new mandatory Denver Green Code requirements. So when we look at the Denver Green Code, there's 10 different chapters listed here. From the structural engineering perspective, we're really focused on this chapter 9, which is the materials and resources chapter. So you can see in the new construction column that within that chapter 9, you have to meet 3 different provisions. And then for the major commercial renovations, you have to meet 1 provision. It was noted that there are 116 different provisions that you can try to meet. So requiring 3 or 1 for now is not a big ask. And the overall arching idea here is that we start to become familiar with not just, hey, what's the minimum that we can do here to get by, but what are the other provisions within chapter 9 from a structural engineering perspective, so that we understand, again, it's optional now, depending on which one you choose with your design team, but we need to be aware of what's out there because it's likely that these numbers will increase and we'll have to start complying with more and more. So within chapter 9, there are 5 different provisions that can help your design team to achieve one of those 3 points for a new project. There's the embodied carbon dioxide limits for concrete and for steel. So those are the first two, MRO2 and MRO3. And then there's the environmental impact of your building materials. There's design for deconstruction, and there's the use of salvaged materials. So when you're looking at this chapter 9, we're not going to dive into each specific provision with each equation that it requires. But as an example, for MRO2 and MRO3, we'll dive into those values and how it compares to the Buy Clean Act. But there are embodied carbon limits that they have provided in the Denver Green Code, and it would be up to us to provide those in our specifications and our construction documents. For the environmental impact of building materials, some of these provisions have, okay, pick 2 or 3 out of the 5 listed, and you can choose with your design teams which makes the most sense for your project. So for example, you could be able to prove up to 10% of a recycled content for a certain percentage of your volume, or a certain percentage of your cost, I believe is what it's based on. So depending on what you decided as a design team, you can choose the different provisions and how it makes most sense for your project. So when we're looking at the embodied carbon of concrete, it's cast in place concrete. And there's 2 different ways within that MRO2 provision that you can meet this requirement. One is that depending on your concrete strength, you have to provide EPDs to show that you meet their global warming potential shown in this table. Another option is they provide an equation and they say, okay, if you can prove that your project as an average or a weighted volume is what it comes down to, can meet a certain threshold, then that's the second way that you can comply with this. So in that example, it would be up to us to have that equation in our specifications or in our construction documents to show this is how we're complying, and then it would be up to the contractor to show the EPDs that support that you meet those limits. Also on this, the values are based off of the 50th percentile GWP product-specific EPDs that were available in EC3 at the time that this provision was developed. For the higher strength mixes, there's also a 30% increase in the limits. That's how they got those values. When we're looking at steel, you can see the global warming potential limits for steel potential. There we are, there it is. And so the provision here requires that a minimum of 75% of your steel based on cost that it complies with these limits. These values were developed using 150% of the AISC industry average values. When we look at a quick project example, again, there are a number of different ways that you can get to those, the number, the 3 provisions that you have to meet. So for example, what this would look like is you sit down with your project team, you go to chapter 9, you say, how are we going to get our 3 points for our new project? And then you can go through and decide, okay, we have these different structural options and we have these other options such as mercury content level of lamps that maybe the architect knows that's an easy point for them. So they take that point, and then we know we have a lot of concrete in our project and we have some building materials that will help comply with the requirements for meeting those environmental impacts. So for example, you could choose MRO2, MRO6, MRO7. Those would all get you a point. If you go to MRO7, they have different options. You can choose some prescriptive requirements or some performance requirements. So maybe you choose to go with the prescriptive requirements. I believe once you get to that section, you can choose 2 of the 4 or 5 options. And then you can say, okay, well, we know that our concrete is being regionally sourced. That's one of the benefits of concrete in Colorado. I think they have regional as within about 600 miles. So you know that that's an easy point that you can get. And then maybe you have a lot of timber in your project. So you know that the bio-based point is an easy one that you can document. So that's kind of how you would go through that procedure. And it's not, that chapter 9 is not long. It would be easy to sit down with your design team and talk through those different options. But at the end of the day, it comes down to what we are required to show in our construction documents. So the agency, the City and County of Denver right now, they are working on developing resources for us. So videos and handouts of how we can take this information and apply it. And then they're also responsible for ensuring compliance. Their take on this is that by this mandatory Denver Green Code, it is not adding cost to your project. And really the only way that it would add cost to your project is if the design team is uninformed and is trying to catch up last minute and come up with requirements that you're not prepared for. So the best thing that we can do is be proactive in this and work with our design team to make sure that we're looking at these considerations at the beginning of the project rather than the end. From the consultant perspective, what we're looking to do is provide this required information into our construction documents. And then it will be up to the architect or the prime on the project to then submit all of our documents for permit. And within this, there will be some sort of a form that will be submitted. They said it will be an easy form. It will likely be an Excel format. It is still being determined, but that's what we can look toward. And then from the contractor perspective, the idea here is that now we've given them direction in our construction documents. It's up to them to collect the EPDs to show that they are meeting our requirements, and then they will take the EPDs that they've gathered and they will give them to the inspector. So in order to have your certificate of occupancy, you have to pass all of your inspections. In order to pass your inspections, the contractor needs to provide the documentation to show that they are meeting the requirements that we have in our construction documents. Again, they're not providing a waiver for the Denver Green Code, so a little bit different than the Buy Clean Act. There's no waiver out there. They expect you to meet these provisions. So very quickly, we'll just wrap up looking at some similarities and differences between the two. For similarities, they both require the contractor to collect EPDs, and they both require documentation in order to obtain the certificate of occupancy. As structural engineers, we're required to include the necessary information in our specifications and our construction documents to comply. And then another similarity is just that the GWP limits are likely being developed from the industry average EPDs from AISC. We say likely because Denver Green Code, the Buy Clean Act is still coming out with those values. In terms of differences, Buy Clean Colorado is regulated by the Office of the State Architect. Denver Green Code is the City and County of Denver. Buy Clean is submitted through your L1 form at the end of the process to get your CO. The Denver Green Code the process is through your permitting and through your inspections. Buy Clean is effective January 1st of next year, 2024. Denver Green Code has just gone into effect as of May 1st. Buy Clean is updated every 4 years. Denver Green Code is every 3 years. The GWP limits, so the eligible materials under Buy Clean includes the additional materials that Kim mentioned. Under Denver Green Code, it's concrete and steel. And then GWP limits for concrete are a little bit different. So those values will likely not align potentially ever, depending on when they update them. So keep that in mind. You just have to be aware and keep an eye out for how those values are changing, and we'll try to keep you updated on that. GWP limits for steel, although they're both based off of industry averages. For Buy Clean, it's likely the average, whereas Denver Green Code, it's 150% of the average. So still a little bit of a difference there. What to expect moving forward? We expect more states to pass the Buy Clean legislation. The states that already have Buy Clean, we expect an expansion of scope, and also the policies that are beginning to be developed that those will actually go into effect soon. The Inflation Reduction Act will make EPDs to become more available for us all to use, and which is really exciting because then we have transparency in our materials and we can actually measure the impact of our buildings moving forward. And then that will also help to create more focus on the carbon intensity of the structural materials. And lastly, an increased adoption of a kind of whole building project approach. Kim touched on this as well, is just, a lot of these policies will likely start heading toward life cycle assessments and looking at the whole building impact and what is our carbon intensity per square footage and how can we bring that level down. So that's where we think that we are headed next. Here's a list of resources. At the top of the resource list is the Sustainable Design Committee. We are here to help each other work through all these changes and make sure that we're aware of what's around the corner. So feel free to join us after this meeting or chat with us and we'll get you on the list for our future meetings. We'd be happy to answer any questions that you guys have. Thank you.
Thank you guys for that great presentation. We have a few minutes for questions.
You're at the point the contractor submits the final EPD calculations and everything, and they don't meet the requirements. You have a building, you can't get a occupancy certificate, then what?
So when the two different sides, obviously it depends on if you're working under the Buy Clean Act or the Denver Green Code. What we were told by essentially at the end of the day, they both told us that you would not get your certificate of occupancy. I think that it made it sound like they both had some flexibility to that initially. And I think that from the Buy Clean perspective, they made it sound like if someone did not comply, the waivers are their way out. So specifically the construction waiver from the Buy Clean Act, it would sound like it would be kind of a later in the fact kind of a thing, but that would be their current way out. From the Denver Green Code perspective, I think that the standards in terms of the concrete and steel GWP limits and that kind of thing, if it comes back and you're not quite there, I think that ultimately they feel like it is achievable and that there's no reason that you shouldn't be able to meet those standards. So from our discussions with them, the Buy Clean made it sound like it was a little more flexible. The Denver Green Code made it sound like there was not much flexibility, but they also made it sound like it wouldn't get to that point. We'll see.
Thank you.
You're welcome.
Oh, it goes the online, okay, thank you. There was a stat at the beginning of, I think, your presentation, Kim's, about something about 40% of all embodied carbon is in building materials, and then the other pie chart's at 11. So I don't understand the difference between the two.
Yeah, so the 40% is the total carbon emissions. So that includes like energy related emissions and things like that. The pie chart showed the 11%, and that 11% is related directly to building materials. Here, Kim will click there too so we can talk through it better. So that 11% is what's directly related to the embodied carbon portion of that. The rest of that 40% is the building operations side. And then did you want to talk to this slide as well?
So this, This is, so the 40%, like Mackenzie said, is everything. And then this was the pie chart at the beginning of mine that is just differentiating public versus private. So it's within that 40%, what's the breakdown between public and private?
This one, so this is the building materials and construction. That's the 11% that specifically speaks to the embodied carbon. The remainder of that, so that 28% is the building operations. So energy related, not specifically what's in our carbon material.
Hey, just to clarify, does Buy Clean Colorado ever apply to private projects?
No, not right now. Correct. So Buy Clean Colorado only applies to publicly funded projects. Tax dollars.
This may sound kind of weird, but with goals of reducing 80 to 90% over the next 40 years, how is that realistic? I am already designing at optimal amounts of material. There's no way to reduce my building materials to 80%.
I agree. That's why it caught my attention, is because it's, they're putting that number out there. I agree. It's not achievable. I think that, it's great to have a goal, but California right now is finding out on their limited amount of projects that they have already going through that this is a bit of a challenge. And so the problem is that they're in California, because they were on the forefront, there's very much a disconnect between the policymakers and the people actually having to implement these policies. So DGS in California has struggled, and it's been really hard because they were handed this and said, you have to implement this, and they had no tools, they had no, it wasn't achievable. And I think that that bill that's in their legislature right now is right along with it. Although I do think that now they're smarter, DGS is more involved with the policymakers, and so they can kind of rein that in. So I don't expect that it would ever be passed at that level. And I agree with you that it's likely not achievable in that time frame.
As a follow-up question, we have these embodied carbon values that are being listed and produced and everything. Ultimately, the manufacturer or supplier of the materials is responsible for providing that information. What body governs or oversees that those numbers are actually valid? What prevents them from just putting a number on their material that makes it look 10% better something?
You mean in terms of validating the EPDs that are being submitted? So those environmental product declarations are big picture, the standardized format. And so what you want to look for there is that it is a type 3 EPD. And that ensures that it is a third-party verified environmental product declaration, so that manufacturers can't just go out and make their own and claim a certain number. It needs to be third-party verified to comply with these policies. And those environmental product declarations are based on international standards that have been developed and that they are all referencing to make sure that they're on the same playing field.
A couple of online questions. So do you know if Buy Clean Colorado will require specific PCRs for each material like Buy Clean California?
So the PCR is the rule by which the EPD is generated. So I think the question is likely whether it should be facility specific or product specific. So if that's the question, Colorado is product specific and California is facility specific. California is the only entity that I've seen so far that is requiring those facility specific documents. Everything else can be product.
Yeah, and then also in terms of the Denver Green Code, depending on which provision you're looking at, you can get different amount of points for different EPDs. So I believe if you were to use an industry average EPD, you could get 1 point that would go toward those provision points that you have to reach. But if you're able to get like a facility specific EPD, they actually granted you 2 points or that kind of a thing. So it's something to keep in mind as you're looking through the Denver Green Code as well, that depending on the EPD that you're able to provide, it's actually some are valued differently.
That was it for online so far.
So will the Buy Colorado or whatever, Buy Green Colorado, will that apply to grant funds as well, like say historic structures that take grants from Colorado, or is it only tax funded?
I believe, that's a good question. I believe it's just tax funded, but we can dig into that and verify that with them.
Sorry.
Hi, Buy Clean Colorado requires that EPDs are provided before the products are installed. Does the Denver Green Code have the same requirement?
So the Buy Clean does require, so there's the kind of the two different steps with the Buy Clean. The first step is that contractors during the bidding process have to verify that they can provide EPDs that are industry average and meet the requirements like you're saying. And then they have to actually obtain those EPDs and submit them at the end of the process. The Denver Green Code, they essentially leave it up to us as a consultants to make sure that when we're specifying the different materials that we're using, it's up to us to be aware of the GWP limits and what can be provided, but we're not collecting EPDs at that time. It's more of a design team responsibility to make sure that we can meet those standards. And then on the contractor side, that's when they actually have to obtain those EPDs. So that would happen during the construction process.
What the consultants are required to provide is like a snippet or a snapshot of your spec that you've put it in your spec at the time of permit. You have to provide that then for Denver Green Code, but not the actual EPDs.
And it has to be, you have your checklist that you fill out, and then their point was just make it clear, show it in your specs or your construction documents, what those requirements are. So just that was the one requirement, is trying to make it clear so that they can go to it quickly and check it off.
We have another online question. How are technologies like injecting CO2 in concrete treated by these acts? Do they offset the embodied carbon or factored into final reporting?
So it's going to depend on what the technology is, and that gets really into the weeds with the PCR and the EPDs. So the PCR is the rules by which the EPD can be created. It also kind of governs what of those technologies you can take into account when you're creating the EPD. So for concrete, if it's some kind of alternative cement or something like that, that can easily be incorporated into an EPD. So then it can be documented so that it can apply to the legislation, to the policies. There are other technologies that are currently not specifically allowed by the PCR, therefore they cannot be incorporated into an EPD, and therefore they cannot be used to reduce the carbon intensity for these policies. Does that make sense? Depends. The best answer.
Where would these requirements be located in the specifications?
Depends on, so for for each it'll be different. So for the Buy Clean, it would be for concrete and steel. You'd have it in your concrete specs and your steel specifications. So for example, you could have the EPD requirements in your information submittals. At this point, we have not been told that they have to be stamped. So for that example, you could provide it in your information submittal section. So it just depends on which material you're dealing with. But essentially, you'll look at your specs and you can, it's concrete, it'll apply in your concrete specs, and you can kind of pick and choose where it makes the most sense is how we've approached it. But each firm will likely do it a little bit differently. So if you want to come brainstorm with how everyone's doing it differently, we'd be happy to chat about it more too within, we have these discussions in our committee often. Yeah.
All right. Thank you, everyone. We'll wrap it up. Sorry we ran over, but that was an amazing presentation and great questions. So great discussion. Thank you.